There we go. Well, today we have with us Dr. Jodie Dewey, and we're really excited to have her here. She's a research scientist who pursued her graduate degree really believing in community and lived experience-driven research, and really believing that those two things really hold the key to improving programs. She brings this vision and I think tremendous amount of energy to her current position at the Lighthouse Institute, which is kind of the research arm of Chestnut Health Systems, which is a private healthcare system. She uses mixed methods and she collaborates with community and community stakeholders often. And she participates in several health justice related research projects where I know she's going to talk to us about the direct impact she makes on everyday practice. So we're really excited to have you. Welcome, Jodie. We're so glad to have you here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So before we kind of get into all of kind of the practical experience that you have and really talking about the work that you're doing now, I kind of want to take kind of a step back and kind of go back in time a little bit. And so you have like a super cool story, having talked to you before about kind of this like non-linear journey that you've kind of really been on. You've worked as a probation officer, you volunteered in the Department of Corrections, and you worked as a police dispatcher. So I feel like you've actually seen a lot of the system. So kind of thinking about all of those experiences in practical settings, either individually or together, how do you think all of those real practitioner experiences have really shaped kind of your research journey and your interest in research?
You know, I don't think I realized it at the time that those experiences were important. I think that I was doing, I grew up in a very middle class, blue collar environment. And I think those were just typical jobs that people went for, right? Like you got into policing, or I have a brother who's a firefighter. And so, I remember my dad always saying, just do something with your name on the door. And there was not a whole lot of push to go through academia. It was just get done with high school, get out into the world and start working. And so I think those experiences now looking back were extremely important, because now that I'm in sort of this academic and research sort of area, and certainly in research, there are many people who've had experiences like mine, but definitely in academia, I was not seeing that. Most people had sort of gone through, graduated high school, went through the traditional route through academia. And so, they didn't have a lot of life experience in working with people in these different settings that they were studying. Sure. And I've always been interested in, the way that people who often don't have a choice and having to navigate through these social service systems, the way that it impacts their daily lives. And I think I realized really how important that was when I was a probation officer. And I remember thinking to myself, here I am, 24 years old. I have no life experience. I'm not married. I don't have children. And, and here I am like supervising people who are having these major life, like traumatic experiences, and they're being regulated and dictated and disciplined by a system, by me. And it felt really uncomfortable. And I thought that's where I started to get really interested in, getting those stories out there. I didn't know that was research at the time. To me, research was like numbers and quantitative, and it did not entice me at all. I was always interested in the stories. And so, I'm glad that we're seeing more and more of that in research, and sort of from the ground up kind of investigating.
Do you think that those experiences, I think, I was writing down for myself the idea that you were supervising people who are having a characteristically different experience than you, who may be older than you or even similarly aged as you at the time. And I that was really powerful. I like wrote that down. I'm like, oh, that's something to think about and like sit and think about for my own work. And I wonder, how did any of those experiences, either that particular one or others, shape any specific types of questions that you ask?
I trying to think. Here's the thing. I remember when I was a probation officer, and I remember, I remember the first day, I was given a book that I needed to read and sign. They gave me 5 minutes to do it. So it was apparent to me I was not really to read the manual about how to do my job, that there was a way of learning, there was an informal learning process that was going to happen on what they expected of me. And it was at that moment that I realized, wow, we're doing something else, right? We have these goals in mind of what we should be doing, right? So for example, with probation, the overarching goal was to ensure that people didn't recidivate, to provide them as much support as possible to get them through this probationary period so they don't recidivate. But the reality is that we were just trying to end cases. We were trying to lessen our caseload is what we were really doing. And we were trying not to overburden a court that was inundated. So even if somebody broke a rule or broke a guideline, we couldn't revoke them because the courts were too busy. So I realized there was all these other things happening. And so that was really interesting to me. And then to think again about the way we are all pieces of this process, that we are constructing it as we go. We don't just have this idea of the way it should work, and then we work towards that necessarily, that we're producing it as we go. And that became really fascinating to me. And sometimes we do things that literally undermine the goals that we have, right? There's all these contradictions. And I'm somebody who's just, I never liked answers to things. I always felt like there were no answers, that there is this gray matter that we're constantly operating in. And to me, that's what sociology is, right? As a sociology, I followed sociology through my undergrad all the way to my PhD. That's what sociology is about. It's about social processes, and they're constantly moving. They're constantly in flux. We can't nail anything down. And so, yeah, I think that's been a push for me in the work that I do, is uncovering that, right? And that guides the questions that I ask, because I start from there and I say, tell me how this happens. Tell me how you are a part of this. What is going on here? I try very hard not to create questions that get people to think in a particular way. I ask them to tell me. And the other thing, and I noticed this is really important, I've been doing qualitative research for over 20 years now, and I have a lot of back experience in working with people who are often the ones who are the subjects of all these projects, right?
Sure.
But I'm also very much aware of my white privilege and, other privileges that I have. But it's always about pulling from my own past experiences, right? So for example, currently right now, the work that I'm doing is I'm studying those individuals who face housing instability and who are in recovery and sometimes on medication for opioid use disorder and going through withdrawals and all these other issues. And not only do I have experience in that in terms of volunteering, but I also have, family experiences with opioid addiction, with being in the prison system. And so I draw on those because it's important to feel connected to people when you're telling a story, right? And so I'm very mindful of that. And so those are it's important for me to connect and relate and ask very open questions. Like, the only thing I'm interested in is how you experience and feel this, right? And so figuring out ways to dig deeper, but create the safe space that people need to do that.
I think that's so profound and so wonderful that your brand I'm thinking about even the brand as a researcher simply being like, I'm just interested to understand how you experience something and feel it. And that is the research that you do. And that feels so powerful and useful and applicable anywhere. And to say, I'm really interested in your experience with this system. And I'm really interested in curating a safe space for you to tell me about your experience. Mm-hmm. And that really being kind of who you are as a researcher. I feel like, at least for students who are similarly situated of wanting to answer some of those questions, that feels like a really easy thing to be able to tell industry, right? Like, this is who I am as a researcher. All of this work that I've done in all of these spaces and all of these places can really be aggregated up to, I'm really interested in understanding people's experience navigating this thing and helping them talk about that experience in a safe environment. Mm-hmm. And it feels like such a maybe it feels too clean, but I think it just feels like a powerful way of how to talk about yourself and talk about the research that you do.
Yeah, and I think what I'm learning now, that because I was in academia for 17 years, so I had never had a research position per se.
Sure.
So one thing that I'm learning in this position, and especially I'm learning a lot about how to talk about the work that I do, because one, in a space of traditionally quant people,
Sure.
they not all of them certainly, but many of them have never really engaged with qualitative researchers. They don't know the value, they don't maybe see the value. And because a lot of times grants, what they're interested in is money and time. And so when money is on the line, and time is money and time is on the line, and performance measures are very clearly outlined, it's unclear to some people that don't understand qualitative research, what's the benefit of it? It's just going to suck up time and energy and money that we don't have. And so I actually just took a class, and this is also really interesting, because I think about qualitative research. I took courses as an undergrad and a graduate student, and it's all like grounded theory, and it's very specific educational process in that way. But I started going to courses and classes and reading up on methodologies for qualitative research, because it's grown so much, and I just haven't been a part of that because I haven't had to really think about my methods so much. But now that I'm in this new space and I want to sell myself better in doing that work, it's important to kind of be up to date on that. Like, what are people doing? What is the lingo? How are they using different kinds of qualitative research? And not just, hey, we're studying people who use this service, let's see how it goes, but also, well, this organization is implementing a program, but how come nobody is taking them up on the offer? Right? So you can actually do qualitative at different points of a clinical trial, for example. And so learning how you can carve some space out for the work that you do, even in these very traditionally quantitative spaces, right? Even in like I just took a class on Friday about the benefits of qualitative research in a clinical trial, from the very beginning of dealing with ethics all the way to the end result of, what you're hoping to find from this population.
And where are you taking those types of classes?
I look everywhere. So and this is the other interesting thing, right? So again, I am not somebody who was initially academically driven, right? Sure. I grew up in a home where it was not valued to have a college education, right? You were just somebody who couldn't make it in the world, so therefore you went on for education, right? You didn't have any common sense, my dad would always say. And so, I was working against a lot of that stereotypes and even getting into academia. But now I've been socialized there that the only kind of good education or good knowledge must come from a 4-year university. But in this kind of applicable kind of industry, I took a couple courses with this one university program, and it was so theoretical. And I thought, this isn't going to work for me. I need this information now. I needed it yesterday so I could be a part of this project. So, I took I've taken training with Max QDA, which is a software. So they offer a lot of courses. They last 1 hour to 2 hours on every topic you can imagine and how to use that program in doing qualitative research. So I've taken a lot of those courses. Bristol University out of the UK offered a course specifically on how to use qualitative research in clinical trials. So there's just these bits and pieces that I'm grabbing from all these different spaces. So that's kind of.
I love that. I watch a lot of Coursera classes. I
did that too.
Yeah, I love those classes. I think they're so well done. But I think what you bring up is something that I think is very true, at least in the experience that I have in industry setting, is that these spaces believe that multiple sources of information and knowledge are expertise. That I am one of several people in a room that is an expert. I might be a research expert or a theoretical expert, but that the person next to me who is a practitioner is the practical expert. And the person next to them who went through, maybe let's say, who has a conviction on their record is the process or expert, right, of the justice system, or the expert on the impact of the justice system on them. And I feel like that's something that I think is worth highlighting, is that in these spaces, there is much more varied expertise, and also recognizing that you are one of many experts, and really having a real reverence and respect for that as you're moving through these industry spaces too. And thinking that your own learning can come from varied places, not just traditional university classrooms.
And I think building on the point that you just made is not only are we all useful because we all have this different kinds of expertise, but not to make assumptions about people, about the kinds of expertise they have. So for example, I was just in a meeting, I'm supposed to be the research expert, right? And so I'm in a meeting with two doctors, and I was trying to sort of hold myself in a very conservative way because of my perception of them and what I thought they would want of me. And all of a sudden, the doctor just got really informal and comfortable and was like, I really wish you would be more critical of the system. And I was like, oh my God, I love you, because like you don't think, right? So this individual had a lot of background on harm reduction policies and principles. And, it's also not to get caught up in that if this person is representing that role or that kind of expertise, doesn't mean that they didn't come from all this other background, either lived experience, or maybe they do have a PhD in some theoretical, maybe they've written papers. So it is interesting. I'm trying to keep more of an open mind on how people got to the position that they're just presenting themselves to me at this moment. Like what was their trajectory like,
Totally. I think that's really important. And to think about, even to go back, I think your commentary earlier about also being a person of using all of these spaces to also learn how to talk about your work better, to talk about the value of the work better, learning about where you can insert it into spaces. I was thinking your commentary about like qual work being time and money. As someone who's also a primarily qualitative researcher, we implement like a lot of things at JSP. We help sites implement things. And then as the researcher, my job is to then evaluate the thing that they implement. But as the qualitative researcher, I say, well, there's a whole bunch of meetings that happened before we implemented the thing, of a bunch of decisions that happen in those meetings. I'm already going to be in those meetings to facilitate the meeting. Why don't we have someone taking notes? Why don't we record the meeting, right? Like, how can we build in qualitative work and then use that as data to say, what kind of decisions got made in this meeting? How are people making decisions in this meeting? And using the spaces that we're already moving in as other data points.
Yep.
And I think that has been, but being able to advocate for that, right? To people who don't understand, hey, this is what it looks like. Here's how we could use this data. These are the kind of documents, deliverables, and help we can provide. So I think that it also means being creative in these applied spaces too, of how to use your methods.
I think you make a really good point, because those aren't things that we really thought about. Data was always taken at the end point, right? Yeah. And that goes back to the way, like when people ask me like about the topics I've studied, like what ties that all together? I think for me, it's always, how do we know what we know? How did knowledge get developed, right? Like we didn't just arrive at this space. The terms that we use, the way that we think about processes, how we think things should go, right? Those were developed over time through conversations, whether you're setting up a research project or whether you're deciding how to process people through some social service system, right? Like there's a lot of taken for granted knowledge that we haven't tapped into as sociologists or as qualitative researchers. And I think that to me is really interesting. Like, okay, so why do we think this is the best way to do it? Well, it's always been done this way. I remember I was in a meeting with somebody, and I had something, what's nice about being an outsider, like this is a new space for me in terms of the topic. I mean, I've never specifically studied people who use opioids or people who are on methadone or buprenorphine, going through recovery and those kinds of things. I'm aware of it, and my world has circled around it, but never specific. And so I was interviewing somebody who's talking to somebody who is in, in one of the programs. And I said, and something like popped out to me, and I was like, why did this happen? Like, why was there this issue or this problem? And, she was like, oh, it always happens like that. That's just the way it is. And it was like, but why is it that way? Like, how did we get there? What happened that allowed us to not even notice that? Whereas someone as an outsider, that was like a warning bell to me, right? Sure. So that's what I love about entering new spaces too, is that I'm there with fresh eyes. It's not something I'm overly comfortable with. It's nice to be uncomfortable, because I think that you become a better qualitative researcher in that sense.
For sure. So given that, while you were getting your PhD, I know you did a lot of race and maybe traditional policing work. You also moved through kind of at the intersection of transgender or gender studies and health, and specifically how transgender people navigate the health system. But now you've kind of, as you said, you worked in academia for 17 or so years, you kind of left. And so thinking about that transition then to this space that you're at now, how did you kind of know, you're leaving this behind, you're going to try something new, you're about to get really uncomfortable. How did you know where you wanted to go and what kind of you wanted to do? Did you have a process for kind of teasing out the world of options that were before you?
Well, let me just be really honest and say that, from my background, for me to get the opportunity to become a college professor felt like I could never go any higher. Like I said, I was the first in my family to go to college. My parents didn't even graduate high school. There was support, but not really. They didn't know how to help me with that, right? So this felt like, wow, leaps and bounds. I have just just as a prodigy, right? I just blew my whole family out of the water by doing this thing. And it felt like, where else would I go? There's nowhere else to go but down. And so unfortunately for me, that was not a good way to think about it. It is just a job. Let's be honest, it's just a kind of a job. All jobs have responsibilities. All jobs expect the very best of you. I was lucky to be in academia because what it taught me to do was to create boundaries and balance, because there's not a whole lot of balance in the work that we do. And I think that's becoming more important post-COVID, right? How do we balance our work-life balance? But I was at a university that was a teaching university. It required a lot of my emotional labor, but it did not expect a lot of research or presentations, although I did do a lot of that because that's what in my mind was a successful academic, right? Is that you put your mark on the world. And the fact, I remember when I first published a paper, nobody in my family really grasped the immensity of it, but for someone from my background, that was unbelievable. I published something that someone's going to read. And so to me, academia was just this huge success story. And then I did not intentionally leave, and so not to get into specific details, I left and I had nowhere to go. I had no idea what I was doing. And the sense of loss, just cleaning out an office of 17 years, all the books I collected, all the friendships that I made, all the work relationships, I didn't know where I could go. And it's funny because I'm on a Facebook group of other academics who are either currently trying to leave or have recently left. And I know that feeling is very common because you put all your eggs in one basket. You think this is the only thing that you're even good at to do anymore. And academia makes you think that these other spaces are not worthy, right? You're in this silo, really. You're not really interacting unless you create that for yourself. You're not really interacting with non-academics. You're not in these very applicable spaces. And so looking back, I wish I would have done more of that because that's what I really loved. But anyway, just to kind of bring you up. So I left academia. I had no idea where to go. It's like you're trying to rebrand yourself in a way, and you don't know where your identity is. It's like a horrible breakup. So yeah, I was floating for a bit. I knew that I was interested in gender and race, and I was interested in equity. I started just reading as much as I could. Thankfully, because of COVID and unemployment, I could float for a bit. And so I just did as much reading as I could, hoping to create my own company that I could I was hired out to a couple organizations to talk about, inclusivity and diversity and how to actually build a structure to do that. But I wasn't sure that I wanted to keep teaching people, to be honest. I was kind of burnt out from teaching. And so a friend of mine had called who was a part of this organization, Chestnut, and asked, he needed a qualitative researcher. And I'd never thought about being a full-time qualitative researcher because I didn't know it had any value.
Sure.
And so, I started just doing some contract work with them. And then more and more opportunities came up. They realized they needed somebody. And so I formally interviewed with the organization. And it was amazing because I realized that academia isn't necessarily the best space to do the work you want to do. That sometimes these organizations have more money, more support, they're more open-minded, and they allow you to be the professional that you are. And like you were saying, everyone in the room has an expertise and they get that. All that competition was gone. In academia, there was so much competition. And so I didn't experience any of that because we weren't competing against anyone. We were on teams working together. And I didn't have that in academia. And I'm not saying everyone does, but.
I think I talk about this a lot in all kinds of spaces, that I feel like there's so much more team work that happens in industry spaces and so much more collaboration that happens that it just takes the edge off a bit. And I was thinking even recently about how we have a large project in the state of Illinois doing something, and we had contacted a different faculty member at Loyola who had just previously finished something in the state of Illinois. And we said, we're struggling with XYZ. Did you reach these barriers? And he said, oh yeah, I had those barriers. Here, let me send you the IRB application that I finally got through after 7,000 rounds. Let me send you my coding syntax because that data took me forever. Let me send you. And this man just opened up, all things and handed it over. And I was almost shocked by how giving and gracious he was to us. And I said, is there something we can do for you? He says, I don't know, maybe one day I'll call you up and I'll let you know. But it just felt like those are the kinds of interactions I find myself having more and more, rather than the interactions I had where I said, hey, I think I have this grant in Pennsylvania. I know you did work there. And then I get what are you trying to do? Who are you trying to talk to?
Yeah,
I don't know. And there's a lot of gatekeeping that's happening or weird blocking. And in these spaces, I don't necessarily feel that that's true. And I love your sentiment that these spaces in part allow you to be the professional and researcher you want to be, which I think for most of us, just a kind researcher who wants to ask good questions in safe spaces, right?
Yeah. Well, the point of you saying that is one of the biggest challenges I have is that, I'm learning a lot about how to ask when I need something and how to even articulate what I need, because so much of academia is that there's never enough funding, there's never enough resources, and there can be so much competition. Like you said, people are afraid of you stealing their ideas and whatever the case might be, that it's like, you don't even want to tell people what you're doing. So yeah, I didn't realize that it could be different. And so it is much more rewarding. And I could talk a little bit more about the weaknesses that I might have, right? Like, I could be more honest about like, yeah, I don't know what that is. What is that program? I've never heard of that program. Oh, you got to get this program. You should look it up. I could admit when I don't know something, and that's all the time, right? Like, how can we know everything?
Totally. Well, so now, so it sounds like by good circumstances, these things kind of lined up for you of sorts, that you started as a contractor and then built that out of them saying, actually, you do really great work. We actually need someone full time, and kind of maneuvering into that space a little bit more seamlessly. But you went from as I remember, a fairly traditional criminal justice-esque kind of research and work to a place that is like justice adjacent, perhaps, or maybe health justice related. Can you talk about kind of the transition of moving maybe slightly away from the discipline in which you studied and kind of what that experience was like? And I think one of the things too that we talk about with students is that I often encourage students to look at behavioral health broadly, or health justice, or education justice, right? These justice adjacent fields. And folks not really having a good understanding of like how they parlay into those spaces. So can you talk to us a little bit about kind of your experience of moving into something a bit more broad or adjacent to justice, and kind of how you felt and how you did that?
Yeah, let me just back up and say that, I've also been reading a lot about gender. And I think that at least women of my generation, we've been socialized to always apologize for ourselves, to never think that we're good enough, that we never know enough. And so, you sort of bring that with you through the years. And so when you leave academia and you have this added layer of, well, I've only been teaching for this long, you don't know how to sell yourself, right? And so then you see all the ways that you don't meet the expectations or what you perceive the expectations are of this place. And so it was like, oh my goodness, I'm going to be a research scientist. Well, I don't do just this, I don't even have that much, I do a little bit of SPSS, so you're thinking of all the negative, all the things I must not be able to do. And then you think, oh, well, I don't work specifically with substance users. I don't even know all the lingo, right? And I'm not a doctor, and I haven't been studying health specifically, right? A little bit of medical sociology here and there, some trans stuff, but don't talk too much about that because people get weirded out about the trans stuff. So there's all these layers that you're navigating. And then you've got this voice that says, well, you're just never good enough anyway, right? And so it's important to see the overlap, right? Start from a position of, I am the most qualified. Certainly there are 20 other people that could be equally as qualified, but I'm the most qualified. And let me tell you about the experiences that I had and why it gives me a leg up on either conducting really good qualitative research, connecting with people, interviewing people, analyzing results, disseminating results, working with stakeholders. And trust me, there's a lot of things I had to learn because I haven't had to work with people in 17 years. I feel like someone that came out from underneath a rock, So yeah, it's really just about trying to find the way to sell yourself. That's really all it is. And the thing is I had to go back to what I would always tell my students who were nervous about presenting one of their papers for the first time. I would say, you know what? You're the expert on that paper. Nobody can tell you that your paper is not good enough because they didn't do your research, they didn't read your literature reviews. I don't care how they make you feel. They don't know as much as you in this moment about exactly what you did. So you fake it till you make it, and you just come off super strong and confident. And so that's when I realized this is the point that I need to do that, right? And it was really hard because I was already in a very low position of being unemployed and looking for a job. And but it was like, okay, let me think back to all my experiences. And I dug back. I was like, wow, I taught GED courses in a prison system. What did I get out of that? And, the fact that people trusted me to be there, and the fact that I worked with guys of different ages, of different abilities, and I taught math. I got a C in math. How the heck did I teach math to people, right? And so, I remember sitting at the library and going through GED books to learn as much as I could so that I could be the most effective person. Like, I was 21 years old when I did that. I'm phenomenal, darn it, So like, being positive about what you've done and really seeing it for what it is rather than what people have made you believe it is. And so that was hard for me because women aren't supposed to speak really highly of themselves. They're supposed to be demure and quiet and follow somebody else, right? And so that was huge. And I work at a place, thankfully, that values that is like, what do we all offer each other? They come to you, like even the person who's 2 levels above me will email me and say, oh my goodness, I need your advice on this. Can I show this to you? Like, then you feel comfortable doing it with the person that was just hired. Like, hey, I know you're new, but hey, I got this problem. Can you help me with this? Right. And then we all value that. So that collaboration is really built into the organization. I'm sure that not every organization is like that. So it's easy to do it there, but yeah, that's the advice I can give for people is, try to figure out why you are the best person. Go through the application or go through the job description and look at the key words. What are they looking for? And then prepare what you're going to say to show how you are, all the things they're looking for, because you are. It's just like, think of it like a paper that you're writing, right? Or a literature review that you're writing. You're trying to convince the reader of something about this topic, why it's important. Well, you're the topic. Why are you important? And just think of it like that. That's what I had to do. I had to think about all the skills I had in writing papers and publishing papers and use myself as the subject matter.
Well, and I appreciate that you almost have to kind of like look into your soul and be your own hype girl. right? Or a hype person rather, that I think I tell people all the time when I send them postings, they're like, oh, I don't think I'm qualified for that. I'm like, I didn't send it to you if I didn't think you're qualified, one. And two is that, all of those bullets are nice to have. If someone had all of them, that would be real nice to have. But I'm going to guess that they really only expect somebody to have 50 to maybe 60% of those bullets. And so if you have 50 to 60% of the bullets on a job posting, you're absolutely qualified for that job, right? The other ones can be a nice to have, particularly if they're things that you can learn on the job or maybe are specifically unique to that space. And I think people, and maybe perhaps particularly women, or folks from differently minoritized communities, believe that they have to be all the things to be qualified to do it. And that's certainly not true. A good friend of mine who's like this, like very handsome 6'2" white guy. He's like, I'm very mediocre, right? Like just channel, but I have a lot of confidence, right? And so, he's like, channel the mediocrity of me, right? And so, or the confidence of me. And so I think that we oftentimes say, I can't apply for that until I prove that I can do all of it. And you don't necessarily have to do that, particularly in industry spaces. No one's expecting you to have done it all anyway.
Yeah, and it's important to find where your gaps are and read or listen to people who have good advice. I came across, somebody had posted something on Facebook, and it was a woman who was giving some good advice about how you convince people that you're worth more at your job to get a better raise. And, when I entered into academia, I wasn't even given the opportunity to negotiate, whereas male colleagues were. And plus I was so young when I was hired, I didn't even know negotiation was a thing, really. And so I think about the 17 years I was there, if I had negotiated even $1,000, $2,000, $5,000 more, what would that mean economically over 17 years? I mean, most young people don't think of that, but now that I have bills and debt and a house, I'd like to travel more, I think about those things. But I came across this blog, and this woman said, it's not even about knowing how to sell yourself. It's also knowing who you're selling yourself to. And so research shows that, most men are in positions of hiring, right? Majority of the time we're going to be interviewing with men. And so men have this idea about what men should ask for when they take on a job. They expect them to negotiate, but they don't expect women to negotiate. And in fact, they're less likely to give women raises when they negotiate. So I'm like, well, I'm in a really bad position. So then how do I do this? And so she gave some really good tools about you don't pitch yourself against this person. Like, you think one thing, I'm demanding something else, but you sort of spin it like we're on the same side. And I remember she had said something like, you say, listen, you would not have hired me in this position unless you expected me to push back and have my own mind and to think this way. And so just for this moment, I'm just going to be a little bit on the other side than you, but I'm going to push for XYZ. And so what it does, it allows the presumably male person who's hiring you to not feel like something's being taken away from him if he gives in to you. Now he's on your side. And I thought, man, it's such a mind game. It's like a chess game, right? So yeah, I just, as a gender scholar myself, I had to go back to the basics. Like, come on, read this stuff. This is what you do. It's not about everybody else that you're studying. It's also about you. And so, I just, ask people to dig deep in what they've already been doing. It's there. You've been doing it. You just don't think about it when you're going for a job or you're trying to get something that you want. But dig back into those things that you already know and use them to your advantage.
Totally. I love that. And I love the idea that I'm a gender scholar. I know how this plays out.
Yeah.
So let's think about how maybe I can not let it play out for myself. I appreciate that. So now, we said that you're at, that you're at Lighthouse Institute, which is inside of Chestnut Health Systems. And so for everyone here, can you help us orient how you would describe Chestnut Health? So, is it a for-profit research center or a corporate research center? Like, how would you describe it in context of the industry?
So Chestnut Health System is a large nonprofit health organization. And so they provide all kinds of services in the state of Illinois. And then I think in Iowa, I want to say.
Sure.
So we have multiple offices, in Illinois. And the Lighthouse Institute is the research arm. And so that is it's a grant-funded research institute, and so I work under one of the senior research scientists there. I don't know how many total research scientists there are. I know for sure there's at least 3. And so everyone is, it is, in some ways, it's kind of like academia because everybody has their area of what they're interested in, but it's all related to substance use, recovery homes, housing first, and it's just wherever the money is, right? So for example, if a health organization gets a grant, then oftentimes by law, it's required that they have an outside evaluator. And so we're one of those outside evaluators. And so some of these research scientists have brought projects when they took on the job, they already had their own, so they have their own relationships. They develop a lot of those funding opportunities. Sometimes they're more internal, it could be a lot of different things. Like, for example, there was one interview that I was doing with one project, and they were doing another project on a completely different health related issue. And they thought of us. They're like, oh, wait, we need an evaluator for this. Do you guys do diabetes work? And it's like, well, it's just evaluation and research to us. It doesn't matter what the topic is. And so then that's something that they might be pursuing. So we could essentially, like right now I'm doing a project on community health workers. One is on recovery housing, and I just applied for a grant to continue recovery housing. It's a case study for recovery houses, looking at the models that they use to specifically house those that are engaged or receiving medication for opioid use disorder and involved in the criminal legal system.
What's interesting as you were saying this that came up for me is that one thing that I think makes these industry spaces distinctly different than academic spaces is that in academic spaces, there is a real elevation or priority of you going down a rabbit hole of one very small sliver of the system, right? And then just really knowing every part of it. And in these spaces, there is a real advantage to understanding how to ask good questions. Period. And then being able to apply that in a swath of different spaces. Once years ago, I was told that I would look too all over the place if I didn't stay in my lane, so to speak. Where over here, the ability to have been all over the place and all over the map is actually a real advantage, because I can say I've asked different questions of different populations and different settings and different spaces. And so it struck me as you were talking about that, you have a swath of research coincidentally that you came from, and then now you're doing a swath of research that you're like, it doesn't matter that it's on diabetes. To us, we're just going to ask good questions because our brand is that we want to understand somebody's experience, how they feel about it, and ask them those questions safely.
Yeah, and I feel like as you exit academia, it's really important to pull yourself, because I heard that same thing too when I was graduating with my PhD, because I switched from like criminal justice, race, crime, and I switched over to medical sociology, gender, and specifically transgender healthcare. I did it because I was interested in it. And, I didn't think about the way those topics connected or the way the skill set connected. But I was told the same thing, like you're going to pigeonhole yourself and, people aren't going to see the real value, blah, blah, blah. It's a very small population, but you have to then just educate people that they're not thinking about it the right way, right? You can't think about it as topics. That these are cross-cutting skill sets, right? That these are theoretical overlaps that are very similar, right? So I'm always trying to draw those parallels, right? So I could read a book that's about one topic, but it's really sort of the way people see the processes unfold that I then pull out and go, this is kind of happening in this space too. This is really fascinating. And then you sort of hook your work into other disciplines, which I think is really important. And you're right. These things are important in doing research, because I'm not just studying this topic and then this topic and then this topic. I'm studying the way these systems unfold because we have a shared interest in improving these systems, right? Yeah, and I think you're always going to come up against things that you have to think about. How do I rework it by using my expertise? So recently, for example, I'm writing a paper right now about some of the experiences of people who are in recovery homes and from their perspective. And I had somebody review it who has a lot more experience than I do in the system per se. And, they try to explain, well, maybe this person's not understanding. This is what's actually supposed to happen. That's probably what they're responding to. And I'm like, yeah, but that's not the point. It's not the point what the policies and practices dictate. The point is that if people don't experience it the way that you want them to experience, to the point that they have poorer outcomes, then there's a disconnect and a problem, right?
Sure.
And so this paper is written from the perspective of people who have to navigate these systems, who also have these shared life complications like housing instability, substance use, major family trauma, and then disadvantaged neighborhoods. And, all of that together forces them to have a different experience than you or I might have to this same system. And so like that, those are the stories I want to get out. I know the way it's supposed to work.
Yeah.
It's not working, right?
So then given that, can you talk to us a little bit about then like when you were doing research today in your current role, like who is the audience of your research? How is your research being kind of used? And kind of what are the products that you're producing out of the research itself?
Well, and it depends on who the audience is, and there could be various audiences within one project. So,
Sure.
So for example, if I'm like in one particular project, there is the person, so there's levels of people, right? There's that person who works at that organization that you meet with once in a while, and they just want the big takeaways, elevate the largest things I need to know to run this system. And then there might be somebody at the more mid-range level where they're the ones supervising the people that you're interviewing. Okay, what do I need to know to do this job better? And then there's the individuals, who are doing the work, and they want information from the clients. Okay, what's working, what's not working based on what the clients think, right? I've had to create lots of different reports depending on, who needs to know it, how much time do they have to know it, what are the big takeaways, what are they going to do with the information? So some people, and it's been a huge learning curve because I've never really had to do this. This is nothing like going to a sociology conference and presenting a couple of slides. So for one person, this might be they want very clear graphs. One person wants, all the quotes and they want you just to tell the story, right? Some people just give you 30 seconds on a Zoom call and don't have any visuals, So it could be anything. It's very different depending on the project.
Okay. I think that makes sense then. So then I guess I know that we're kind of running towards the top of the hour. So for folks that are here, feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions if you have them. But I guess I'm wondering then, in a space like this that is a bit more collaborative and there's different audience members, kind of how is success then measured? So how do you know in your position, like you're really killing it, that you're doing a good job?
Yeah, it's funny because, I guess there's on the one level, it's, are you doing all the things that you're supposed to be doing and not creating more burden for someone else? Right. Sure. Because like you are, even though I have a supervisor and he ultimately, the responsibility falls on him. I have to make sure to make his life easy, right? Like the things that he's given me to do, they have to get done and they have to be done. Right. But I think from like moving up in that organization, in order for me, for example, to move up to the next level, you have to at some point be bringing in your own funding stream, right? These things don't operate on their own. And, publishing. So bringing in your own projects, publishing, and, doing presentations, it is still very much like we want to keep ourselves relevant. We want to keep ourselves on the map, right? Because it reflects well on the organization. So it is like academia in some ways. Mm-hmm.
It sounds like then most of the Lighthouse Institute in particular is almost exclusively grant funded, which means then your salary is tied to the fact that there is an ongoing pipeline of grants coming down. Does that sound right?
Yes.
And I think, kind of the language that I would use is kind of a soft money field, right? That in spaces like mine, and it sounds like yours, urban to some extent, Vera was like this for a while, that's kind of the term soft money, right? For folks that are in the audience, that's kind of how we refer to these fields that are almost exclusively grant funded. And as a subset of places to go, which means that not that there is insecurity in your job. That's not true. Like, I'm sure you feel very secure in your job, as I feel like I do a good job. I'm probably going to stay. But there is a bit of pressure and tension there to know that if I'm not actively writing grants to backfill myself, right, to back pay myself of what's coming down, then I'm having to rely on other people. And therefore, if the money is not coming in, then we are not working.
Well, there is a little bit of that for sure. After my experience in academia, though, I realized that I inappropriately assumed that there was no risk in any space. And I had tenure, as did many of my colleagues, and we were let go. And so tenure has no legal standing. I had no idea that tenure had no legal standing. I would have thought very differently about my job had I done a little bit more research and realized how easy it would be for them to get rid of all of us. So with that being said, yeah, I don't know if I've gotten to a comfortable position that there is no security, and that's regardless in the level that I'm at right now. You have to show people why they need you, right? And so if people haven't thought about the way you might fit into their project, well, then you better be thinking about it, right? Because you want to not only keep yourself relevant and keep yourself useful, but that also benefits you because you're meeting more people, you're connecting to more people, and then people think of you when things pop up. And so it's like a forced networking that, we probably should have had it more in academia, but there was just so much competition, it was hard to do that. So I think it's a healthy dose of insecurity. It's motivating.
I appreciate that every space, regardless of how the infrastructure or that company is funded, is going to have some kind of risk to it. It's about understanding what that risk is in that space, and do you have tolerance for that risk? I think that's really thoughtful. And I also thinking about this idea also of advocating for yourself in your current role. I think that's so true. I mean, so many times have I, even in the 3 years that I've been at JSP, said, I want to do X differently. I don't want to do this anymore. I want to be more doing this. I want to be closer to this. Can I have a project that does this? And then people saying, yeah, okay, great. We have it, or let's go get it. And so, but I think that circles back to your earlier point of saying you are enough. You have to be your own hype girl. You have to advocate for yourself, and staying relevant. And always, to me, someone told me years ago, framing myself as what value do I add here immediately, and what value do I add here long term, and being able to constantly articulate as you're moving through a workspace.
Yeah, and take note of everything you do, not just the things you think have value to your organization, like publications or presentations. Also take note of every course you take, of every lecture you sit on, every panel discussion you sit on, and keep a notepad of all those things you've done and why they were of value. What did you learn? How does it apply to your job? Because when you're up for your review, they're relying on you to sell yourself. It's not their job to remember everything you've done, right? Because in their eyes, they might think, oh, she's only completed one paper, or she only did one presentation, right? So take stock of everything that you've done.
I think that's such a good point. A friend of mine who works in a consulting space, he's like, just keep a running email to yourself of all the things you're doing on the side. And I was like, I don't know. And sure enough, he's like, you're going to go back to it one day. And then I did. And then I was like, well, I'm glad I have all these things here. I don't have to go think about it. I want to see, just to kind of give space for people in the audience, if you have any questions. I haven't seen anything come in on the chat, but I just want to give space for the last few minutes here. If anyone had any questions, feel free to raise your hand or come off mute.
Hi, Dr. Dewey. Just a quick question. It was really nice hearing you talk about all of how your real world experiences before and during academia really helped get where you are now. I am an international student and I'm doing my PhD in clinical psychology. And I was wondering, within like the criminal justice research outside of academia, um, a lot of things that I see are things that I can't apply for because I'm not a citizen. Is that very common, or are there places where you can work without citizenship? I just was curious.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have information on that. I'm really not sure how that occurs or why there might be barriers to that. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if, I'm sorry, I just don't have that information.
No worries. Thank you.
I will say that we have featured Dr. Sarah Desmarais on here. She's now the current president of PRA, which is Policy Research Associates. I'm going to say something that I think is 99.9% accurate, is that she is Canadian. And she speaks, I think, specifically to this issue. I think somewhat in her recorded session that we have on our website, which I can find for you. She also is an amazing human and has made herself completely available to lots of students, despite being a president of her company. And so I know that she feels really passionate about kind of this issue of how to work through citizenship barriers. And so she might be a really great resource for you. I'm trying to pull up her session now so I can send it over. This has come up multiple times. I think that there are lots of spaces that hire international employees. A lot of times you might see it in larger consulting firms or larger firms where they do a lot of visa sponsorship. But it also happens in some smaller spaces that have more of an international presence already. And so let me pull up her session so I can give you her contact information. But I think you certainly bring something up that a lot of us have been talking about, is how do we accommodate or work through with students who kind of are from international spaces and finding them positions. So I appreciate you've given myself, and I think Kelsey here, who's a member of the AltAc team, some more fuel for the fire of trying to hunt down the right people to answer this question to help students just like you.
Well, and the other thing I want to add to that, I think it's really important, right? And unfortunately, we may be in a position that we have to think about changing that structure a bit. But I am a Fulbright recipient, and so I was able to be a part of the expert scholarship where I applied for a project in Dublin, and so I was there working for 2 months. And so these are great opportunities, and I think it's very important to cross. The information should not just be crossed within disciplines, but between countries, because we learn a lot from each other, not just in the practices and how we do work, but the ways we think about work and solutions and those kinds of things. And so, as you move forward in your career, if you're seeing those barriers, make note of them and think about how you might change that. But one thing you might want to look into is a Fulbright scholarship, because it's like an international where you would have to study in any country but your own, and then that host country can take on people. But it is a wonderful experience to share knowledge and information.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much, Jodie. I really appreciate you spending your time with us, giving 3 more minutes of your time to us. I think this has been really, really thoughtful, and I'm excited to see more about what you do at Lighthouse Institute. And I just appreciate you coming in, sharing your journey. One thing that I'm so struck by that you've said multiple times is this idea that you came from a family and a space that didn't prioritize education, and then you blew any wild dream you had out of the water. And I just resonate with that so much. I come from a very similar family, the first person also to graduate and do other things. And I think more and more, particularly as we diversify graduate school, more and more students feel like they're doing something that no one in their family or immediate network has done, and it's hard to navigate. And I think what you do is share kind of the humility and like, it's hard to navigate, and it can be done.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you all. Have a good day.